It is my pleasure to introduce Olivia, Dr. Olivia Sanderfoot. Her pronouns are she, her, and she's currently the leader of Project Feeder Watch at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Super cool that you get to work there now, Olivia. I love that. She recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the UCLA Lacretz. Did I say that right? Lacretz? Awesome. Center for California Conservation Science and the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. And this is the awesome part. She's also the founder and director of Project Phoenix, a community science program monitoring birds during wildfire season. Olivia's research is focused on the effects of air pollution, particularly wildfire smoke, on birds and other wildlife. And she's currently exploring how wildfire smoke impacts bird behavior and shapes species distribution. And Brenna already said this a little bit. I knew Olivia back in 2017. She was an educator with us. And Olivia is the kind of person where you hear all the things she's doing and you're just like, man, that sounds tiring. And also, that's amazing. I want to do all of the things you're doing. And you're just really inspiring, Olivia. And I'm so glad you're here to hang out with us tonight. And I don't know. I love seeing you. Everybody, Dr. Olivia Sanderfoot.
Thanks for that introduction, Carolyn. I'm stoked to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. It's going to look funny for a second because I set this up to share portion of screen. So it'll look weird. I promise. I'm fixing it. Now you should just be able to see my slides. Looking good? Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. I have a very small screen in front of me, so I'm not going to be able to look at the questions that are coming in real time or see anybody raise their hand. So I'm speaking into the mic. I see a little tiny versions of all of you in in the corner, but we'll have lots of time for questions and answers at the end. So as Carolyn mentioned, today we're going to learn about our emerging understanding of the widespread effects of smoke disturbance on birds, which has been the focus of my academic research since I was an educator at what was then Madison Audubon, which feels like so many years ago. But before I dive into my talk, I want to take a moment to share with you a bit more about why I'm here. Typically, at this point in a talk, I would just dive straight into my research, but this is a really special audience. I'm from Madison, and I am immensely proud of my Midwest roots, and I'm especially proud to be from Wisconsin because this is a state with a rich history of environmental conservation, and the organizations hosting tonight's events and the people on this call, like Carolyn and Brenna, my mom, who I think is also here, have had a profound influence on who I am as a scholar and as a leader and as a mother. So I'd like to begin by just sharing a bit about my personal background and why I'm here and why I care so deeply about birds and believe so strongly in the power of participatory science, because it's really your teachings that brought me here. So growing up in Wisconsin, some of my earliest lessons were in Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which is a moral code for living in harmony with nature. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And these are all photos that I took in Wisconsin birding. My grandfather understood this very well. Grandpa was the one who taught me what participatory science was all about. Grandpa lived in Cleveland, Wisconsin, which is a teeny tiny town nestled along the shores of Lake Michigan. And in the late 1990s, my grandpa became increasingly concerned with how local dairy farms are impacting water quality. Lakes and creeks were contaminated with E. coli, and many beaches were closed. The shoreline was caked in algae, and fish kills were common. And Grandpa believed that runoff from fields spread with manure was polluting local waterways, but he needed to prove it. So he founded a community science group to monitor water quality in Manitowoc County. And he brought me with him to his monitoring sites where I would help deploy sensors to test for E. coli and dissolved oxygen, which is truly my very first fieldwork. And the data that Grandpa's team collected showed that dairy farm operations were jeopardizing local water quality and empowered their community to advocate for and win regulations that reduced runoff. And Lake Michigan is much cleaner now. Grandpa taught me that this is the power of participatory science. To develop good policy, we need good data. And perhaps the best monitoring program is one that is driven by those who are impacted by the crisis we seek to understand. Grandpa also taught me the value of finding common ground. He worked with people across political parties, across generations, across faiths, bringing them together to achieve a shared goal. this is truly the Wisconsin idea. This is the mindset and the lens with which I entered my academic career and the beliefs that guide who I am today as a scientist and a community leader. We are all part of a vibrant and beautiful natural world. Our fate is intricately tied to all things that are natural, wild, and free, and only by building community and working together can we solve big problems. The birding piece came in later. Actually, when I was a student at UW-Madison, I had enrolled in a class on birding during my senior spring, thinking it would just be an easy A, which is perfect. And I actually fell in love with it. It's just a wonderful hobby, and it brought me so much joy. And I distinctly remember my spark bird. One snowy morning, I was with my classmates on a field trip in a beautiful woods in Middleton, Wisconsin, and we caught sight of this barred owl. And it was majestic. And I remember just standing there knee deep in the snow thinking, oh my gosh, this owl is just stunning. And I felt lighter and happier than I had in a long time. And in the participatory science programs I lead, I seek to share that joy with folks who have yet to find their spark bird. So that's a little bit about me. But you didn't come here to hear about me, you came here to hear about my research. So let's dive right in. Here is an outline of what I'll be covering today. We have a lot to cover, but I promise there'll still be time to think about questions at the end. So birds are facing myriad threats today, including habitat loss from urbanization and climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, human-wildlife conflict, and pollution of soil and waterways. But air pollution is also a known risk to birds. And yet, air quality is often overlooked in conservation biology and wildlife management. And I find this really fascinating because we've known for over a century that birds are highly sensitive to air pollution. In the early 1900s, in fact, coal miners would bring canaries down into the mines with them to help monitor levels of noxious gases, such as carbon monoxide. And this practice led to the use of the colloquial phrase, canary in the coal mine, to refer to an early warning signal of some future danger. So we've known for over a century that birds are inherently more vulnerable than we are to air pollution, and yet we don't know that much about what's happening to wild birds when they're exposed to air pollution. Why is it that birds are so vulnerable to air pollution? This comes down to a highly efficient respiratory system. Birds just don't breathe the same way that we do. Their respiratory system is entirely different than our own. So humor me for a second and take a deep breath. So when we breathe in, our lungs expand. And when we breathe in like that, we're pulling in fresh, oxygenated air from our environment. And when we exhale, our lungs contract and we expel that stale air out. We breathe in and out, in and out. And this is not how birds breathe at all. Birds actually have rigid lungs that don't expand or contract. And instead, they use this system of air sacs to constantly push fresh air into their lungs. And this unidirectional airflow allows birds to extract more oxygen with each breath than all other air-breathing vertebrates. Birds also have a very thin blood gas barrier and utilize cross-current gas exchange, which are features that continue to support this rapid oxygen diffusion. This highly efficient respiration is amazing for birds because it allows them to do all of the cool things that birds do, like take flight, swim hard, and fly at high altitudes. But this efficiency is a double-edged sword because as birds respire, they also take in any toxic gases and particles that are present in the air at a rapid rate. Furthermore, birds may lack some of the mechanisms that we as humans rely on to clear particles from our airways. So, for example, birds appear to have a cough-like action, but we're not totally clear about how effective that is at clearing debris. And birds also have fewer macrophages, which are these janitorial cells that function as the primary line of defense in the mammalian respiratory system. So just like they're more vulnerable to toxic gases, it seems likely that they're more vulnerable to toxic particles too. Now, why does this matter in the context of what's going on today in our country? So isn't air pollution a solved problem? Haven't we already tackled this? We have the Clean Air Act, don't we? Unfortunately, no. The story of air pollution in the US just begins with the smog events that triggered the Clean Air Act. So, this is a photo I found taken on November 20th, 1953, of the New York City skyline, showing some of the smog events that plagued big cities in the US in the 50s and 60s and led to the Clean Air Act of 1970, which was signed into law by President Nixon. This law gives the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, the authority to regulate emissions and protect public health and safety. And as part of this, the EPA has established air quality standards, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which collectively regulate concentrations of health-damaging air pollutants. There are primary standards to protect public health and secondary standards to protect public welfare. These standards are designed to improve visibility and reduce damage to infrastructure, vegetation, crops, and animals, including birds. And these standards are incredibly valuable in protecting our well-being. The Office of Management and Budget has estimated that 98 to 99% of all the benefits of environmental policy set by the EPA are associated with rules designed to improve air quality. And in general, the cost of implementing the changes in our society that are needed to meet these air quality standards result in 3 times the cost of their implementation. The financial value of this just cannot be understated. One of the key pollutants that the EPA is focused on is fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5. And this includes all of the tiny suspended liquid and solid particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. And there are both biogenic and anthropogenic sources of this pollutant. And this pollutant comes from things as widespread as sea spray to vehicle exhaust. And whether it comes from biogenic or anthropogenic sources, it's a major risk to public health and linked to cardiovascular and respiratory disease, cancer, and premature mortality. We also expect that PM 2.5 has negative health effects on birds and other wildlife. So we have the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act has allowed the EPA to set these standards, including for PM 2.5, which we know has these health risks. So why am I talking to you about it now? Again, is this a solved problem? Well, this chart shows that over time, air pollution has improved in the US. It's actually a really great story. We passed these laws, good things happened, our air quality improved. But in recent years, the story has changed a little bit. PM 2.5 is actually increasing in many parts of the United States and globally. Until recently, these concentrations had been steadily declining. For years, increasingly stringent environmental regulations and technological advancements were telling this really good news story. But we're not breathing cleaner and cleaner air every year anymore, and our air quality is worsening. We've actually lost years of progress, and today about half of Americans are routinely exposed to unhealthy air. And you can probably guess from the title of this talk and the nature of my research where I'm going with this. This is largely due to greater wildfire activity. Climate change and a legacy of fire suppression is intensifying the incidence and severity of wildland fires. And as fires are burning more frequently and ferociously, our communities and wildlife are increasingly exposed to dangerous smoke. This is causing PM 2.5 levels to increase all over the US, not just in places where fires burn. In the age of megafires, we have and will observe more extreme smoke events, both in places prone to fire and those where smoke is a novel occurrence. Smoke is not a new thing because fires have shaped ecosystems that we know and love for millennia, including the Jack Pine forests of the upper Midwest. The places birds live and the lands we love are shaped by fire. So it's not that these landscapes haven't been exposed to smoke before, but this smoke is different and it's being carried by bigger fires, and the timing is all different from what birds were exposed to for their evolutionary history. And to really drive home just how big of an issue this is, I've pulled a satellite image taken on September 9th, 2020, showing fires burning from California up through the boreal forest in Canada, marked with orange dots. And you can see the smoke just billowing out from those fires, some of them just absolutely massive in size, just inundating the West Coast with smoke, blowing it hundreds of miles out to sea. And I know that folks in Madison and throughout Wisconsin have experienced this too in recent years, as smoke from boreal forest fires has blown southward into the northern latitudes of the United States. So you've experienced this, I've experienced this. Very few Americans today have not experienced a toxic smoke event, and it didn't used to be like that. One of the most powerful plots that I've seen really compares the number of days of poor air quality that populations are experiencing between 2006 and 2010 and 2016 and 2020. And you can see that in that 4 year period, there was an 11,000 times increase in the number of days that folks were exposed to hazardous air quality. So, what does all of this mean for birds? This is the mystery that I have sought to unravel during my academic career. To establish a foundation for this new area of research as part of my PhD at the University of Washington, I led a comprehensive literature review to identify and synthesize studies on the effects of wildfire smoke on the health and behavior of terrestrial wildlife, including birds. And we found that research on this topic is extremely limited, and most studies are observational, and very few have applied rigorous statistics to explicitly test for an effect of smoke. But if we consider evidence from a wide range of fields, my training is from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, so I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. If we look at evidence from air pollution toxicology and veterinary science and ecology, we piece this all together, we can start to put together a picture of just how widespread the impacts of greater smoke disturbance in the age of megafires are likely to be. So I'd like to walk you through some of the things that we've documented. We know that wildfire smoke is linked to acute and chronic health outcomes in birds. This shouldn't come as a surprise because we know that inhaling smoke is bad for our health, and we've talked already tonight about how much more vulnerable to air pollution birds are compared to people. Birds like us can suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning if they're really close to the burned area, if they're close to the flames where those concentrations of noxious gases are quite high. Inhaling smoke can also lead to thermal and chemical damage to lung tissue in birds and trigger oxidative stress and immunosuppression. And all of this contributes to respiratory and cardiovascular illness. So birds are getting sick from smoke, just like we do. I worked with a phenomenal undergraduate student, Anna Nihei, during her time at UCLA, and together with a team of collaborators, we actually studied this in wild birds for the first time using repeated observations of birds banded at the San Francisco Bay Bird Banding Observatory. And we were able to look at the change in body mass of birds that were captured multiple times within a fire season and look at how that change in their body mass from one capture to the next varied with their exposure to PM 2.5. And we found that chronic exposure to smoke actually did impair their body condition. So we found declines in their body mass, reductions in their body mass as the number of days of poor air quality that they experienced between captures increased. So if they were experiencing more days of repeated exposure or more smoke events throughout the fire season, from one capture to the next, they would lose weight, which is a sign that they're losing body condition, that they are having to mount an immune response to smoke that is causing negative health effects. We also found that the change in body mass we could see this across multiple species in a really compelling way. This wasn't just one species, this was multiple species. I can't actually remember how many we looked at in this study, but it was about a dozen. And this paper is currently available open access, and I'm happy to share it with folks who are interested. The take-home point is we found that repeated or sustained exposure to unhealthy air leads to a loss of body mass in individual birds, and this is the first time this has been documented in the literature. So this has led me to think more about the potential behavioral responses in birds. And I'm going to go back to this outline for a second just to resituate us because I know I'm covering a lot of material and talking really fast. So we have established that birds are more vulnerable to air pollution than we are. We've looked at how smoke is increasing on the landscape, and smoke disturbance is something that people and wildlife are going to have to cope with more and more as climate change increases the frequency and severity of fires in the US and globally. And we've talked about some of the health effects that birds can experience, from respiratory distress to illness, and how this might actually lead to loss of body condition in wild birds. So this tells a very bad news story. And I think it's a complicated story. It's not all good news or bad news because what we haven't discussed is the possibility that birds actually might be able to help themselves out. So when it's smoky outside, generally speaking, people don't go outside. Sometimes folks don't know it's smoky. Sometimes folks don't receive an air quality alert. Sometimes folks choose to go outside anyway. But in general, if the sky is gray and it smells like smoke and you're coughing when you step outside, you'll probably take the steps that you need to protect yourself from air quality if you're able to do that given your occupation. You'll put on a mask, you'll stay indoors. Birds might actually have some behaviors innate to themselves that allow them to protect themselves from some of this exposure and avoid some of these health outcomes. So, one of the frameworks that I've been proposing in my work is stay, shift, go. And this sounds self-explanatory, but it's actually never been looked at in birds or any other wildlife. What do birds do when it's smoky? Do they stay where they are? Do they stay where they are but change their use of habitat, change their behavior in some way? Or do they go? Do they leave altogether? And it's really important to understand what birds are doing when it's smoky because that will help us understand if they are able to mitigate some of the adverse health outcomes that they might experience if they were staying put. It also allows us to do something very cool, which is to identify places and resources that serve as smoke refugia. And some of my preliminary work, which is currently in review, is looking at how birds use different habitats when it's smoky. And if we could really understand this, it would allow us to know which corridors, which places we need to protect near and around areas that are prone to fire, as well as in places that we know smoke will blow to make sure that birds have the resources they need to be successful as they weather out this extreme air pollution event. I also think it's important to emphasize that not all species are going to do the same thing. Birds are highly different. They live very different day-to-day lives. They have very different evolutionary paths and trajectories. They're just different creatures. And so I don't expect that a song sparrow is going to respond to smoke in the same way as a bald eagle. So we have 10,000 species to really think about, which can be overwhelming. So for now, we're really focused on more of the common species that we have lots of good data on, lots of good observations of. So again, by thinking about how behavioral responses fit into the stay, shift, go framework, my goal is to identify the places and resources that serve as smoke refugia, which is a term I hope to coin in the literature soon, determine if species-specific responses mediate exposure, and consider how functional traits, so the ways that species are different and unique among themselves, relate to these strategies. What is it about song sparrows that makes them do something different when it's smoky compared to bald eagles? So we do know that birds are responding to smoke. There is evidence of this. Smoke inhalation has already been linked to changes in behavior of birds and other wildlife, including reduced activity, such as reduced movement and vocalization. And in addition, there are some birds that might engage in fire avoidance or energy conserving behaviors when it's smoky. So it's not just about what birds are doing when smoke is perceived as a risk. Smoke also might be perceived by some birds as an opportunity. For example, birds of prey might move toward a smoke plume because they view smoke as an opportunity to feed, to hunt on all of the small mammals and birds that are fleeing a fire. So it is important to think about this potential for species-specific responses and how the experience of smoke might vary depending on what kind of bird you are. There's also some really interesting work looking at how smoke inhalation leads to expression of torpor in marsupials in Australia. And it seems as if smoke might actually trigger torpor in some species of marsupials. Torpor is a short period of hibernation. Hummingbirds are known to do this to survive colder temperatures or unpleasant weather. Birds and some marsupials are, not all birds, but hummingbirds and some marsupials are able to go into torpor to conserve energy. And if they're doing this in response to smoke, it's probably because they've learned that that means a fire is coming and resources will be scarce. So there's a lot of really interesting behavioral responses to dig into. There are also, as I mentioned, some birds that might move toward fire, move toward smoke, in addition to birds of prey. It's possible species like woodpeckers and some other insectivorous birds might do this, again, seeing smoke as a sign of resource availability. So, I'd like to share some case studies from my work. These are all examples of published literature, unless I note otherwise. So, I'm happy to share PDFs after the talk with Carolyn and Brenna to share out to folks if they're interested in reading more. So, my PhD was done at the University of Washington, and I primarily focused on birds in that state for the really no reason other than I was there and it was a great spot to study birds. There's so little known on this topic. It wasn't like there was a particular bird to focus on. So I just decided to think about the suite of species that I was seeing in my own backyard. And so I wanted to start my PhD with a really simple question, which is just assuming that birds are doing things differently when it's smoke, can we pick up on that in participatory science data? Does wildfire smoke impact how we detect birds in the field? So, if wildfire smoke is leading to behavioral changes, then this is ultimately going to influence the presence or the detection of birds, and that will in turn influence our probability of observing them. So, detection is a little bit tricky. Detection is our probability of recording a bird, of noting a bird and making note of that observation, given that it is present. And so if these behavioral changes are altering the experiences that birds have in the landscape, whether they're there or they're behaving differently, then that's going to affect our probability of detecting them. And so I asked the question, how do day-to-day changes in PM 2.5 influence the probability of observing birds in Washington state? And to answer this question, I pulled in eBird data. I'm sure lots of you are eBirders. eBird is a very powerful platform for participatory science. In this paper, we pulled in 62,908 eBird checklists from 4,865 observers, which is a lot of data. Those checklists are marked here in the map of Washington as gray dots. We also pulled in data on PM 2.5, all source PM 2.5, so not necessarily PM 2.5 from fire, from 71 air quality stations, and those are noted as black triangles. And we pulled all of this data together to model the probability of observing 71 study species that were relatively commonly observed by eBirders in Washington state. And we focused on the fire season, thinking that during those months, PM 2.5 was really only going to spike to levels that would cause us to observe a shift in the probability of detecting birds if it was due to smoke. I'm not going to get into the statistics here, but for those who are going to nerd out on the math, we fitted generalized linear mixed models with a binomial distribution to really think about how the probability of observing birds was changing as a function of PM 2.5. And our models accounted for all sorts of things, not only PM 2.5, but also population trends and habitat and seasonality and daily activity. So we thought about all of the things that might influence our probability of observing birds, accounted for them, and then layered PM 2.5 in on top of it. We even thought about effort. How much time is going into these eBird checklists? How long are folks out observing? How far are they traveling? And after accounting for observer bias, effort, weather, and all of these other things, we found that PM 2.5 influenced the probability of observing 37% of study species, which really surprised us. That was a much higher percentage than we expected to see a signal for because, again, that suggests that for nearly 40% of these species, just the day-to-day variation in PM 2.5 is influencing our probability of observing them. And more so, this relationship was negative for 16 species and positive for 10. And this means that these results can't be explained by impacts on human observers alone, right? So there's no reason why smoke's going to make me a better birder. I'm not going to be a better birder and be better at detecting birds when it's smoky and visibility is impaired and I feel crummy. It's just not going to happen. So the reason why we're interested in this is it really suggests that this is a mix of behavioral responses triggered by differences in the reactions that birds have to smoke. So this is a plot showing the predicted probability of observing birds as a function of PM2.5 for the species that we observed a negative relationship with. So this included a wide range of species, including some birds of prey like the red-tailed hawk, some water birds like the great blue heron, and a couple of smaller birds, but typically they were larger birds that we observed this reaction for. And so it's possible that this suggests that some birds spotted at a distance, like these hawks or some of the terns, maybe the eagle, would have been more difficult to detect due to impaired visibility. But that can't explain all the relationships. Why would bush tit be on here if visibility is impaired? We see those birds close up. So there's probably a wide range of things contributing to this. Um, on the other hand, we have this plot showing that same relationship for the species for which we observed a positive relationship. And there's a mix here too, but notably a lot of warblers on this list. And so it begs the question, are we seeing a change in predator-prey dynamics here? If some of these larger birds of prey are absent or less visible or less active, are some of the smaller songbirds feeling more bold? Are they feeling more safe in their environment and therefore they're more visible? Are they more active because they're actually feeling agitated because of the smoke? There's a lot of reasons why this is worth exploring further. But this paper was the first to really establish that wildfire smoke is influencing the presence, availability, and or perceptibility of birds, which is likely at least explained in part by species-specific behavioral responses, and set the stage for the rest of the research I do, which is all about figuring out the why. Starting with this huge acoustic study that I collaborated on with the Gardner Lab at the University of Washington, looking at how hazardous wildfire smoke events altered soundscapes in the dry forests of central and eastern Washington. So we zoomed in on two areas where we'd already documented these shifts in the probability of observing birds, and we put out acoustic monitors and we tried to capture soundscapes during the fire season in order to determine if soundscapes changed when it was smoky. So there is some research that suggests that mammalian and avian vocalization may decline during smoke pollution episodes, but this hasn't been looked at in the United States. It hasn't been looked at ecosystems like those in Washington state. And acoustic data is a really excellent tool for learning more about how avian activity is triggered by smoke pollution, because we can actually put out monitors and such a wide array that we were almost certain to capture smoke, which was really exciting. So for this project, we put out bioacoustics recorders, these little audio moths, hundreds of them, all over the forest, and we collected terabytes of soundscape recordings. It took forever to do this analysis. That's me climbing trees to put up audio moths, and I had a really great tech team to help with this. In fact, I did very little of the field work. Shout out to my field crew for really leading the effort on this. I was much more on the quantitative side of things, but it was great to get out in the field. So at the end of the day, what an audio recording is a capture of the soundscape at a single place in time. How do you actually extract data from that, right? So for this analysis, we looked at the spectrograms for all of our recordings. A spectrogram is a plot of frequency versus time. And this is just the call of a house sparrow. So you can imagine cheep, 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 cheep. That's the visualization. That's the spectrogram for the call of the house sparrow. But from these spectrograms, you can derive a lot of insight into the larger environment. So you can imagine this is really simple. This is just one bird, but if you have lots of birds calling, the spectrograms become very complicated. And so there are lots of indices that have been developed that help us summarize these soundscapes. Not all of them have been ground truthed. Not all of them work as well as we'd like them to, but some have come through as being really great signals for this particular environment. So we used them for this study. So the normalized difference soundscape index tells us the ratio of non-human to human activity in the soundscape. The acoustic complexity index is a recent proxy for avian activity, and the bioacoustic index is a reasonable proxy for bird vocalization. They're not perfect. It's not as good as getting out there and doing counts, but it was a great first look at how smoke is shaping soundscapes. So we expected that wildfire smoke would actually cause birds to lessen their vocalization in line with previous research in other parts of the world. And that because of this, we would see a decline in some of these acoustic indices used to characterize soundscapes. And therefore, that PM 2.5 would be negatively correlated. And in fact, that is what we found. So if we looked at the average values of these indices before, during, and after a period of hazardous air quality, actually, the air quality event that we looked at was during those 2020 fires that I showed that satellite imagery of at the beginning of the talk. And we found that not only was were these soundscapes quieter and had less likely noise from birds during the smoke event, but that this change persisted for weeks afterwards. So there was a perturbance, there was an immediate effect of the smoke disturbance, and it persisted for several weeks. So that does show that there are changes in bird vocalization. That's one behavior that we should be paying attention to. Another study that I was involved in that looked at changes in behavior that result from wildfire smoke goes back to that amazing work that I did with Anna Nihei at the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. So not only did we look at how birds were changing in body mass from one capture to the next, but we also looked at capture rate at our banding station. So this is a diagram that we include in this paper, walking through what we expect from acute and chronic exposure. So acute is short-term exposure, chronic is long-term or repeated exposure to smoke during the fire season. And we expected that short-term exposure to smoke would lead to declines in bird health, which would ultimately lead to declines in body mass. And we found evidence of that. But we also expected that birds would react differently in terms of their behavior to acute exposure versus chronic exposure. We thought that birds that were exposed to wildfire smoke would be less active, less abundant, or less present in that moment of exposure, which would lead to reduced capture rates. So birds that are exposed to smoke, just like they're vocalizing less, they're in general less active, or perhaps some birds have left the area, so they're less abundant, less present, and that again means it's less likely that we'll capture birds at our banding station. On the other hand, if it's a good air quality day, but birds have been exposed to more smoke throughout the season, they've experienced more chronic exposure, we expect that that has a different effect on bird behavior. So birds might actually be more active, more. And the expectation there is that it takes an enormous amount of energy to mount an immune response to smoke. So if birds are dealing with that over the course of the summer, if they're lowering their activity and coping with health effects, they're going to need to increase their caloric intake as the summer ticks by when the air quality is good. They need to get out, they need to forage, they need to eat. So that's the hypothesis that we're working with. And we did find evidence of this at the station in San Francisco. So the predicted number of daily captures decreased with 3-day average PM 2.5, but increased as the cumulative number of days with hazardous PM 2.5 ticked up. So it's a small effect size, but meaningful, especially when we're thinking about the potential impacts here on bird banding, which is a really valuable type of long-term monitoring. So I want to dive into one more study before getting into participatory science and how you can all help solve this problem. I'm really excited about this paper. This paper is currently in review, so it's not out yet. But this is hot off the press. We've found that wildfire smoke is also altering activity of hummingbirds at feeders in California. So while this doesn't necessarily correlate to Wisconsin, I'm really curious to know if what I share with you all today resonates with you and some of the observations you might have had of ruby-throated hummingbirds during the smoke events that you've experienced the last couple of summers. So the hypothesis driving this work is thinking about how wildfire smoke is again leading to these behavioral changes, which is ultimately going to influence the presence and activity of birds at feeders. Maybe they need to feed differently when it's smoky. And this work was started by an amazing capstone student, Amanda Ung, who has moving on to a really exciting graduate program in physical therapy and passed off the paper to me to wrap it up. So for this program, this project, we leveraged data from a long-term hummingbird monitoring program at UC Davis, in which we caught, banded, and tagged birds with radio frequency IDs. And then we set up feeder stations in two different locations that were outfitted with readers. So every time these individual birds would fly to the feeder, they would get pinged. Ping, ping, ping. And we'd get a read every single time they visited the feeder. So we're detecting all hummingbird visits. And we focused this analysis on the fire seasons, so July through November in 2016 through 2021. And we really tried to understand as PM 2.5, as this marker of smoke pollution changed day to day, how did that influence both use of feeders and activity at feeders? So we found that the probability of absence, I know that's kind of a counterintuitive way to think about it. That's just how these models work. But the probability of absence decreased for these species of hummingbirds, Anna's hummingbird, Allen's hummingbird, and black-chinned hummingbird. So we found that birds are more likely to use feeders to stop by at least once per day when it is smoky. But we also found that they were slightly less active, that the predicted number of visits per day declined with smoke exposure. So they're more likely to use feeders, but they are a little less active, which tells us that feeders might actually be a really valuable resource to birds when they are coping with smoke events. So there's a lot more that we need to dig into there, and we don't know if this would hold up for seed eaters or birds that eat other types of foods at feeders, but it's something that we're looking into at Project Feeder Watch. So in the last part of this talk, I want to share with you how I leverage participatory science to answer some of these questions and how you can all get involved. So clearly, there are a lot of effects that we've already found that are very fascinating, but there's a lot more research that we need to be done. Okay, so it's evident that we need to ramp up research on air pollution impacts. It's much easier said than done, and that's because it's really difficult to study smoke because we don't know where it's going to be smoky. So this is a side-by-side satellite image showing smoke pollution over the western United States on September 10th, 2020 and September 11th, 2020. And you can see on the left that there is not so much smoke in the red circle, and on the right, there's lots of smoke in the red circle. So you can imagine being a field biologist going out there, unless you're gonna wait all summer for smoke that may or may not come, you might not get the data that you need setting up a long-term field study. So because air pollution forecasts are inherently uncertain, this just presents a major obstacle in investigating avian responses to smoke. And that is where you all come in. So I really believe that the key to unraveling the mystery of how wildfire smoke is impacting birds is participatory science. By engaging the public in data collection, we can survey birds at spatial and temporal scales that were once impossible. And with more folks on the ground surveying birds, we're better able to study avian responses to rapid and unpredictable changes in air quality. And this is the motivation behind Project Phoenix, which is a community science program that I launched in partnership with UCLA and the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County in 2023. We are collecting bird observations from participatory scientists during the fire season, and we have built this platform on top of eBird. A key question that I get all the time is, well, why not just use existing eBird data? It's a great question. I did that for some of the other research that I shared with you today. To move forward, we really need more consistent surveys before and after smoke events so that we can build these clear records of where birds were and were not before, during, and after hazardous smoke. And we also need to collect fine-scale habitat data, which isn't available in eBird, but it is available if you ask your volunteers to provide it. So all of our volunteers have told us about their bird baths, their bird feeders, all of these microsite features that just wouldn't be possible to know if we just collected data on eBird. So we're compiling this data now. We've collected data on the presence and abundance of birds in these three states, Washington, Oregon, and California. And there's some talk of expanding this next year. And we will be using this data to evaluate the impact of wildfire smoke on bird distributions and really consider if responses vary across habitats. I'm really excited to think more about this question about whether or not smoke is changing use of feeders and bird baths, because this is a question I get all the time from the public. Are there more birds at my feeders? Are there fewer birds at my feeders? Why is that? What can I do to help? And so this data that we're collecting is going to be able to help us answer that question. It's also really easy to participate. It's something I'm really passionate about is making participatory science easy, especially for beginner birders. So folks choose their own monitoring sites. They conduct weekly 10-minute counts. They submit their data on eBird. They submit a one-time online survey to register their sites, and then they just get going. And it's been a great way to involve beginner birders in our science. I think there are emerging opportunities to use other data sets that are not commonly thought of as good data sets for fire and smoke ecology as well, because the fire season is unfortunately lengthening. So we're seeing fires occur earlier in the year, we're seeing fires occur later in the year, we're seeing fires pop up far outside the traditional fire season. And it's is really impacting communities on the West Coast and in the Midwest because of all of the additional smoke that's blowing into your communities. Um, I was living in LA during the Palisades fire. This is a picture of the smoke from the Palisades fire from our corner. My family and I did evacuate from the Palisades fire because we were just a few blocks away from the burn perimeter. This is a photograph that we took of the Eaton fire on the way out. Um, I don't think my slides are changing. Okay, there we go. And here you can see the final map of the Palisades fire, and the blue triangle marks where our apartment was. So we feel very fortunate that the fire did not reach our apartment, and very fortunate that we had a place to go to avoid the smoke. I share this story to point out that this fire took place in January. This was a mega fire that took place far outside the fire season and at a time of year that was entirely unexpected for a mega fire of its magnitude. And this is just one of many, many fires in recent years that have taken place during the winter time. And this is really tragic for human communities. It's posing new challenges to wildlife communities. But as an ecologist, trying to problem solve, I also think this tells us that we have really exciting opportunities in Project Feeder Watch, Christmas Bird Count, some of our long-term participatory science programs that take place in the wintertime to learn more about how fire and smoke disturbance impacts birds. We can use data from Feeder Watch to think about how birds respond to the immediate risks of fire and smoke. We can think about how birds are returning to burned areas after post-fire recovery. For folks who aren't engaged in Feeder Watch is a little different than eBird. Feeder Watch isn't a let's bird anywhere, everywhere. In Feeder Watch, you pick your site, you return to your site. Typically, it's your own yard or your balcony for a 2-day count every week, all winter long. And we have this data going back 40 years. It's a really amazing data set. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with a lot of feeder watchers who have been doing this for 25 to 40 years, which is remarkable. And this allows us to actually think about when these rare events have happened in recent years, can we compare them to the data that we collected historically and think about how birds are acting differently at our count sites? How are the presence and abundance of birds? How does that vary when we have fire and smoke in play? This is also an interesting opportunity to think about fire and smoke effects at the wild-urban interface, which is largely neglected from fire ecology. We just don't really know a lot about how birds are responding to fire in urban areas. Here is a map, a participant map of feeder watch sites for LA, and you can see from the red dots that we had a lot of folks who were in the burned areas participating just last year. So we definitely have some data. We want to be mindful about how we tell the story given the loss here, but it's really interesting to think about this. So if you're interested in joining Feeder Watch, it's possible that your data will help to solve this question of how wildfire is impacting birds. Feeder watch also layers in behavioral interactions, which is pretty cool. So wildfire smoke could influence the way that birds relate to each other. There's some evidence that wildfire smoke might be weakening social ties in acorn woodpeckers. And so we have these observations of behavioral interactions in our data set too, and I'd be really keen to think about how air pollution is changing behavioral interactions. I want to skip ahead to talking about Nest Watch, which is another opportunity to get involved. So Nest Watch is another program run by the Cornell Lab, thinking about how the data that we can collect by repeated visits to nests all spring and summer long. And we actually recently compared Nest Watch records from 2018 to 2022 with 2023, which is a really bad smoke year, at like 37,000 nests, and found that the timing and success of reproduction might be changing with wildfire smoke exposure. So this is really just a whirlwind overview of the different participatory science programs that are engaging in this research right now, from Project Phoenix to eBird to Feeder Watch to Nest Watch. And these are all opportunities for you all to get involved and help solve this problem. And in fact, you might be part of a different, smaller regional participatory science program that has really cool, valuable data that could be used to better understand smoke impacts. I think it's really missed opportunity in ecology to not spend more time collaborating with atmospheric scientists and environmental scientists more broadly, because I think we actually have all of the data sets we need to answer these questions. It's just that we're not talking to each other and making those connections. So you might run a participatory science program that's collecting really cool data on birds or insects or bats. And even if it's local, all you need to do is get in touch with someone who has some cool air quality data and put it together. And if that's of interest to you, you can get in touch with me anytime. So we're winding down on my hour, and I'm sure there are questions, and I covered a lot of material, but I want to end on how you can help, because I find that when I give these talks, people feel very overwhelmed because I don't have a lot of good news to share about wildfire smoke impacts. Like in general, it's not good for birds. We're not exactly sure how well they can cope with it. It's probably only to some extent. It's happening everywhere. It's happening very fast. We don't know what to do. That's true. But we're trying to figure out what to do. And if you engage in participatory science, you will help us solve these questions. But there's more that you can do to help birds. And I think one of the best things to think about is how we can help birds year round, right? Because it's not just about helping birds when it's smoky. We need to make sure that we're helping birds all year round so that they're in the best possible condition and the best possible position when the smoke hits. So the ways you can help, in addition to being a participatory scientist, is really by being an advocate for birds. You should vote in every election, because every election matters, and the people who make decisions about the lands that birds need are in power at every level of government. And you need to speak up for birds and the habitats that they need, contacting your local officials, writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor. And I know sometimes these efforts can feel futile, but I promise that history is on our side, and that will prove not to be the case. In addition, there is lots that we can all do to make our built environment safer for birds now. We can do our part to reduce window collisions. We can keep our cats indoors. We can plant native gardens. We can revisit our lifestyle to lower carbon footprint and reduce waste. And all of these things collectively will make it easier for birds to thrive in the places where we live and work, and set them up for success so that when the smoke hits, they can persevere. So, with that, I'd love to say thank you to all of my amazing advisors and my incredible team and my growing team of collaborators here at the Cornell Lab, and my husband for taking care of my 2-year-old who's been running back and forth this entire time screaming, and I really hope you haven't heard that. And I would love to take any questions.
Thank you, Olivia. That was so interesting. We do have some questions in the chat, and if anyone has questions that you haven't typed in, you can do that now, or you can save them and unmute, and you can ask them too. But I'll read the ones that are in the chat for now. Christy's wondering, how do you think that the policies that are changing now and will change in the future that relate to air air quality control and protection, how do you think that changes the observations and the data that are collected?
Yeah, that's really interesting. If I understand the question, it's about how the recent changes to how we are implementing the National Ambient Air Quality Standards could influence these observations in the future. Yeah. Okay. So it's complicated for a couple of reasons. First of all, different states are going to do different things in response to these changes at the federal level. Um, and there might not be as much of a punch to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards if we're not enforcing them to the same degree, but there's still a demonstrated benefit of keeping our air clean for people and to protect public health. And I think that many states will be motivated to continue to do their part to protect air quality, and there are still policies in place that require counties to report air quality, and communities will be unhappy if they see that their air quality continues to deteriorate. On the other hand, National Ambient Air Quality Standards aren't doing a super great job of protecting public health from wildfire smoke because there's only so much a county can do when there's wildfire smoke coming in from a place that's hundreds of miles away. So I actually think a, a good jumping off point from that question is thinking more broadly about how we collectively and internationally think about environmental policy so that it's not just about what's happening in Madison or in Dane County or in Wisconsin, but it's actually about what's happening in Canada with their boreal forest and their prescribed burns, and how is that going to affect my smoke here? And there are lots of things we can do to mitigate smoke that actually have nothing to do with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, including prescribed burns and really excellent forest management. And there are things we can do to protect people and birds, even when it is smoky. As far as what I think the observations will be, I think that we will continue to see people go out birding and I think we'll continue to see that we don't observe birds in the same way when it's smoky. And if we get some more days of bad air quality, that'll just strengthen the evidence that we have. I hope that
Mhm.
answers your question,
Yeah.
Christy.
I hope so too. I didn't ask it, but it seemed like a thorough answer to me. So thank you. Mary asked, have you or has anyone else studied the effect of smoke and fire on breeding behavior and outcomes? And you did mention this shortly after Mary asked her question relating to Nest Watch, but can you go into more detail about what some of the findings are from that?
Yes, I can. This is currently in peer review at like a really high impact journal. So I've been asked to not share any of the figures right now, hoping that that gets published and is out this summer. But very briefly, yes, I recently co-led with Dr. Haley Spina, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Toronto Zoo, a paper leveraging martin watch data and nest watch data to look at how four cavity nesting species, including eastern bluebird, tree swallow, I'm totally blanking on the other two. They might come to me. Anyway, for cavity nesting species, how did their reproductive success vary with smoke exposure as a result of the 2023 fires that burned in Canada and inundated the Midwest and the East Coast with toxic smoke during the breeding season? And that, again, does not typically occur. So it was sort of like a natural experiment. And we found, broadly speaking, that smoke seems to delay egg laying, which could lead to a phenological mismatch in the environment with birds hatching at times that are not ideal, and also reduced hatch success. So, pretty big stuff. We've been asked by reviewers to incorporate 2 more years of data. So, if the results hold with 2 more years of data, that'll probably be published this summer. If they don't, then we have to think a little bit more about those results. But preliminarily, that's what we're seeing is that wildfire smoke occurring during the breeding season has small but significant outcomes for reproductive behavior and success.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to go back and look at our kestrel nest box data from that year now and the previous couple of years and see if we
If
can
you want to
notice
do that, I
anything.
already have smoke data for Wisconsin that you could link it to. It
Ah,
would be pretty,
let's do it.
pretty neat. It'd be a great undergrad project if you have any undergrads that want to tackle that.
Yes, great. Carolyn asked, education question. Surprising, I know. Do you know if any teachers are collecting data for Project Phoenix with their classrooms? Because that would be pretty cool, especially if you expand it here to Madison.
Yep, there are several. Hope Elementary in LA comes to mind. Their principal is a really excellent birder, and he's been leading the charge with a superstar group of fifth graders. And then Morro Coast Bay Audubon actually has an entire programming around Avid. Their Avid programming is focused on Project Phoenix and Project Feeder Watch this year. So if we expand, I would love to include y'all in that. And we have some resources that folks are welcome to use or model from for K through 12 classrooms. I wish we had
Awesome.
more classrooms doing it, but I can only think of those two. I think there are three, but I can only think of those two right now.
Great. Good job, fifth graders. Janelle asked, has there been influences of wildfire smoke to the die-off in deep sea birds off the Pacific coast? They did some work in Alaska with this and the possible reasons of the die-off. It'd be interesting to tie it together. Janelle, I
Yeah,
hope I summarized that okay.
that's a great
Or you can
question.
unmute and clarify.
I love that Janelle is involved in coastal observation and seabird survey team, right?
Yes, I got to work with them for a couple of years in Yakutat, and
Nice.
we did this project where we were educated on just kind of possible reasons, contaminations, even like the what was it uh, a type of toxin infection that could cause them to
Mhm.
basically starve. But when you showed the map and that smoke was in that area, I was like, holy crap, that's exactly where all these birds just literally go out and just hang out. So it would be so interesting to see if that ties together to the die-off as one of the, main reasons why they just are starving themselves, among other things, because that smoke is just all in their areas that they just hang out pretty much during like the spring and summer season. So I was very curious about, has there been any contact with any of the seabird coasts, beach watch, or anything that want to get into this study?
Yeah, that's I love that you're thinking about that. It's a great question. So Julia Parrish, who is one of the leaders of COAST, was on my PhD dissertation committee. So she's very familiar with my work. But I don't think that her team has actually tested the hypothesis that you just proposed. I think it's a great one to test, and I think it's only really been in the last the last year or so that ecologists have really taken this up as an issue that we should all be looking at. So it's really exciting to be part of this movement and this growing field. But I think you're right that when you look at those maps, it's hard not to wonder if the die-offs could be in part contributing to that. There
Mhm.
was another die-off of songbirds, largely insectivorous neotropical migrants in the Southwest in 2020, following that same big smoke event. And there were rumors that maybe that could have been related to wildfire smoke. Um, and when they actually collected the birds and necropsied them, they did not find evidence of smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide poisoning. However, I think the story's a little more complicated than that. Because if you imagine yourself being like a little tiny bird that needs insects and you're flying over that smoke, like even if
Yep.
you're not breathing it in, are you going to be able to find your stopover sites? Are you going to be able to refuel the way you need to? I think it's really I don't think that that rules out smoke as contributing. I think it's just that the immediate cause of death was not the smoke inhalation. So there's some people following up on that. But right now it's ruled as what happened is they got there and then they encountered a really brutal winter, and so they didn't have enough resources at that stopover site. It was just freezing cold and there was nothing to eat. But I think the smoke probably played more of a role in that. If you have contacts at Coast that want to look into that, that would be very cool. You might also be interested just being a marine person. It's a really interesting study that looked at dolphins at a Navy base in San Diego and how their responses to wildfire smoke actually caused them to get pneumonia. So lots of people don't think about like aquatic mammals as like being vulnerable to smoke. We think of smoke as being something that's on land, but smoke goes out to sea. And there's definitely a team of people at Cornell who's I'm looking at Brenda, who's on the call. Hi, Brenda. There's a team of people at Cornell that are really trying to connect across ecosystem types and think about this from different angles. It's a great question.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Mark asked, is anyone looking at the impact of smoke on abundance of insects as a food source for bird species?
That's definitely like a hypothesis in our work, right? It's one of the possible mechanistic hypotheses that explains some of the things that we're finding. I don't know of anybody who's looked at that specifically, but there's definitely papers looking at insects and air pollution, and there's also really great literature review on how landscape fire emissions impacts insects. I'm going to see if I can find it while I'm chatting, so I can put it in the chat. But that's a great review of like all the things we know about how smoke is impacting health and behavior of insects. Systematic mapping and review. Yes, this is the one I'm looking for. There we go.
I'm amazed at your multitasking skills. Great. Well, that is the end of the questions that were written in the chat. Does anyone have any questions that you want to unmute and ask out loud? I have a question for you, Olivia. And it is, I know that fireworks smoke and wildfire smoke are very different, but I imagine that there's some overlap in that Venn diagram. Is that true?
Yeah, my mom's on the call. She's a huge fan of fireworks. She's not going to be happy with my response on this. I don't have a lot of good things to say about fireworks for birds. Fireworks are beautiful. I don't want to take them away. I really, really don't. But we do need to think about using them responsibly. I don't necessarily think we should have them during the fire season in the American West when it's already very dry and they've been the ignition for a lot of really nasty fires out there. And the air pollution after fireworks is really bad for people and it's really bad for birds. So I think, I'm not going to take away 4th of July, but the health effects that we found due to wildfire smoke in the literature are going to hold up for fireworks as well. And in fact, there's other stuff in fireworks that actually might make that smoke more toxic under some circumstances. That's a little tricky because wildfire smoke itself can be more toxic under certain circumstances. Like the Palisades fire smoke was really toxic because there were buildings and plastics and cars building. That was not good. So that's probably worse than fireworks. But yeah, sorry, Mom.
Your mom is objecting pretty hard here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we did just a small pilot study about fireworks and wildlife at Warner Park in Madison. And it just, we didn't do air quality testing, but it definitely makes a person wonder. So,
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Olivia, for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge. Thank you to the co-hosting organizations. It's great to see such a big group from all over the state and even all over the country, folks from Texas and Wyoming and Virginia here today. So it's great to have you all here. We'll send out the recording to this in the next couple of days so you can share it with your friends if you'd like. And yeah, thank you again for being here and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun. It's good to see you all and be part of Wisconsin conservation. Those are my roots, baby. I'm glad to be here. See you all soon.
All right, take care.